So on today's calendar, which is the 5th of February, it's Monday, we have listed that Larry Batson is going to be attending. And if Larry Batson is attending, then that means that we eliminate our science class. So for your education and entertainment purposes, I am making this science video for Chapter 3, Lesson 6, as we close up our chapter on plants before we get into our section on animals. This section 6 deals with how plants are used in everyday life all around us, even though a lot of times we simply do not think about it. We have 4 main categories in which plants are used, and then we're going to talk about briefly a 5th one in which we don't even know or realize that it's being used. The idea of habitats, we have habitats all around us at all times. A habitat is just a living space. So our plants provide living spaces for animals, but we also use them to build our habitats, our homes. This school building was framed up with wood, which is a plant, so they are important to us. But then when we talk about the natural habitats, we're talking about all those critters that live around us in this area, in our deciduous woods and deciduous forests, our deciduous trees and pine trees, to give them everything they need, from their food to their shelter and place for them to have their homes. The idea of cleaning water is absolutely vital on our planet, seeing that most of our water we can't use because of all the things that are in it, biggest one being salt. Plants will clean that salt naturally out of water for us, or because we have pollutions out there in our world, we have pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers all around us at all times. If we didn't have plants to clean the water, then they would just be inside of our water, and then we would end up getting sick. So we'll talk about how plants also will clean up all of those pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers. They just naturally filter the water for us before passing it down into our aquifers. Or we have plants that grow along our creeks and our streams and our rivers and our ponds and our lakes, and they break down all those pollutions that are found inside of that water as well. When it comes to protecting the water, we talk about erosion and how the roots hold the soil together. We know in this area that when there isn't any kind of ground cover, which would be grass and mosses and things like that, that all of these old corn stalks that have, after the harvest, they end up getting washed inside of our roads and along our streams, and the dirt also gets washed away. So when farmers allow this topsoil, this ground cover to grow, it protects the erosion and it reduces the amount of soil being washed away. Soil is vital because we can't have any food that's going to grow on our planet if we don't have soil for them to be anchored in and protected by. Products. We're constantly using products even though we may not think about it. But things that we use and wear all the time are made out of plants. From our clothing with cotton and linen and rayon to different types of the bottles that we can use and the plastics that are being used. Furniture, paper, tires are all things which are considered products created from an original form. The 5th one then is something that most of us don't even realize happens, which I learned about back in college, is that we have plants inside of our food, but I'm not talking about the plants that we eat. We're talking about an additive in which a lot of companies use. You may not know it, but we add a certain type of plant as a thickener to a lot of our different foods that we eat. And there are actual farmers out there that grow green algae to support their families and make a living on. And that green algae is all chopped up and added to foods to thicken them up. Because we, as Americans, I guess like thicker food than not. So let's look at our basic oak tree, as you can see on page 125 in your book. One of the captions that it talks about is how it provides food. In an oak tree, that's where an acorn comes from. By the way, there isn't such a thing as an acorn tree. There is only an oak tree that produces the nuts called the acorn. But we don't eat acorns on a regular basis because we don't know how to prepare them. But there's a lot of animals that do. They're basic food necessity for our deer that are in this area. A little further south, you have the black bears, where my mom and dad live in Tennessee. They love to scourge around for acorns, squirrels and chipmunks, of course, as well as different types of birds and woodpeckers that enjoy the acorns. But we also have inside these plants or these trees all sorts of insects and caterpillars that are going to turn into moths and butterflies. These critters survive off of the leaves of these trees. So it's a natural habitat that provides food as well as shelter for different animals. Another caption talks about how we use them as humans on a regular basis. It could be as simple as we use it in the summertime as our shade for our picnics, or we create our furniture out of them. You may have different types of cabinets or chest of drawers, or your tables and chairs that are made out of oak. But the other thing I talked about is how some people just enjoy going and looking at the leaves. We have a lot of people, especially from the south, that come up to Indiana and Brown County, and then all of the eastern coast, northeastern coast, because of how they change their colors in the fall. Down south, their leaves don't change in the fall because it doesn't get cool enough. So those trees don't ever go dormant. Our trees go dormant. Our deciduous trees, they change colors. That chlorophyll begins to stop being produced. Those oranges and those yellows begin to come out, and then that red pigment is produced like we talked about in the last video. So it's just the way we can use trees is just for actual enjoyment. And then the third one that it talks about is the reducing of erosion. Now when you look at a tree, if you go up close and you begin to look at its root system, a lot of times you'll see that the grass doesn't grow really well around the base of it. It's simply because it's shadowing the sun's light and they don't get the light that they need. But you can see the roots and how they're coming out and grabbing onto as much dirt as they possibly can. If we don't have trees that are going to hold back the soil, then we've seen it happen in our open fields. How that water begins to build up and wash away, and it makes all these crevices and creases, and water will just begin to pour. And it's not clear water, is it? It's all muddy and gunky. It's because it's picking up all of these sediments and these particles from the soil and washing them into whatever stream or waterway that it's going to. So when we talk about trees, we can have trees on side of mountains in higher locations, and all those roots try to hold on to your soil as much as possible. The more trees we have, the more root systems we have, the least amount of erosion that we're going to have. Because if we don't have trees and plants to protect our soil, then what we end up with is a big gunky mess that we have to use as our water supply. And no one wants to have to drink that kind of stuff. Another section that we talk about in our book then is the peat mosses and the peat bogs. Now peat bogs can be located in the United States. It's just not something that we've used as a major resource. Europe and Asia, these two major land masses, they use peat bogs quite a bit. They actually have farms that are set up with this sphagnum moss, which is what the peat is actually called. They have all of these land areas, and all they do is they continue to make sure it's filled with water where it's naturally filled anyway, unless there's a drought. And they let all of this moss grow, and then they let it grow, and then they let it grow. It's kind of like our lumber yards, where they have certain sections of trees that they cut down every year, and they let the other ones grow. They have land areas that they let fill year after year after year, and it begins to build layers of what we call sediment. Sediment is just dead and decaying material, but the idea with the sphagnum moss is it doesn't break down to natural nutrients into the ground like we would think with grasses and trees and stuff. It just begins to break down, and it makes layer after layer after layer of dead, decayed material that never completely breaks down. So what they do then is once they drain the water off and they send it into another location, then they begin to take out these giant chunks of it. You can see this is more black, so it's an older peat moss. This is a lighter brown, so it's a newer peat moss. Hasn't decayed nearly as much, but they let it dry out. And then they send them off to these companies where they make these little pellets. Now, you may have seen recently, it's probably been within the last 10 years, that people are starting in this area to get these furnaces inside their homes where they're not having to burn wood. They're burning these little pellets. And what these little pellets are is this peat moss from different peat bogs or swamp areas. And it burns naturally, and it doesn't give off of off all of the smoke and tar and stuff that our woods in this area actually do. So it's a healthier and it's a cleaner source of fuel and energy than what we're used to using if we have a wood burning stove. The other thing about some sphagnum mosses is that there's a lot of people that just like the look of them. So they'll use it on their landscapes and their decorations. You can find these type of areas down in Kentucky and Tennessee where a lot of their soil, you can see a lot of rocks. And these mosses will grow on top of those rocks and it'll give them a nice green area of landscaping. So then when we talk about plants and their uses then, we have two main categories. We have gymnosperms and we have angiosperms. A gymnosperm is anything that produces a seed-like product as it gives off. So we see our pine trees, what we call our conifers, an oak tree, poplar trees. Those all have different types of nuts and different types of seeds that they give off. So when we talk about gymnosperms and we talk about the products that are created that we use on a regular basis, we don't really even think about it. Paper is probably the #1 thing used in schools, and then we as adults don't even think about, well, this used to be a tree. We have lumber that we use on a daily basis throughout our country, especially throughout this area, as new businesses and new homes are constantly being built. Rayon is a material that's created out of a tree as well. It's out of a plant. It's plant fibers, and it's in a lot of different types of materials of clothing that you will wear. Some cellophanes, especially those decorated cellophanes that you put on gifts for baby showers or birthdays or different types of candy stores, these cellophanes are actually a byproduct of a tree, a gymnosperm, because it's a biodegradable plastic, if you will, that we can use for these foods. Rosin is a byproduct of a specific type of tree known as a conifer. If you've ever cut down your own Christmas tree, then you notice you got some sticky stuff on it. Your pine sap. Well, conifer sap or pine sap is used and it's refined and it's made into a couple different products that people use on a daily basis. One is a rosin bar, and people that use those are people that play different string instruments in an orchestra, like the violin or the double bass or the cello. They have to put these on their bowstrings to keep it from wearing down and then breaking as they create friction across the metal cords to create the sound from their instrument. But on the other side, people think about, you know, not so much maybe with the musical part, but with the athletes. There's a lot of athletes that use rosin as well. They call them their rosin bags. You have pitchers that they have a rosin bag, and all it does is it absorbs the moisture out of their hands so that they can throw their ball easier and quicker. You have professional weightlifters or gymnasts who, you know, if you especially think about the parallel bars, the even bars, or what was it? Oh, the rings. You're gonna see them put this rosin on their hands, and it keeps their hands from being moist. It lets their hands slide easier, and it also breaks down and keeps them from getting blisters. Another side product of plants, this item, turpentine, is great to take care of this tree sap if you just cut down your tree. It's a natural solvent. It breaks down different types of gunks and things. One of the biggest things that it helps you break down is the type of paint that's not water soluble. A lot of our paints will be water soluble and we can wash them off. But if you use outdoor paints, then you have to use something called mineral spirits or turpentine, which is a byproduct out of a certain type of tree and its sap. So we use it as a solvent throughout, you know, building, construction, painting, but also there's a lot of big companies for their machines that they have to use a type of turpentine to clean their big machines and the oils and greases. So then when we look at the angiosperms, then they have their own type of seed. Not the big seed like acorns and things like we think about, but the little seeds that are inside of a cherry or an apple or an orange. These are all angiosperms. But in the same way that these are, so are our vegetables. They have their own type of way of creating their own little seeds. Cotton is also an angiosperm. So when you go down south, you can still see a lot of cotton farms. And the cotton is what you find in a lot of your shirts and blue jeans as the base material that they use. It is fibers created from this plant. This would be the flowering part with little seeds inside. They clean out the seeds, they wash the cotton, and then they dye it to make your different materials. And then we also have what is called the rubber tree plant. And it is a plant that is in the tree family that creates a sap, and that's what we make rubber out of. So all of your tires for your cars or your bicycles or your motorcycles, they all have a base substance that's made out of a plant. So that takes us into our 2 questions that we're going to review. We have 1A, give 2 uses for moss. So if you think back to the peat moss slide that we talked about, I gave 1 big one and then 1 that I also mentioned. Those would be fuel as well as landscaping. So our 2 uses for moss, we use it for fuel. We have the peat moss bogs that they make the pellets out of, and we burn them so that they're not going to pollute the air and they keep us warm, but also just for it to look nice because people enjoy plants and greenery around our homes. Why is sap important? Well, sap is important because it can be used in many different professions. From the turpentine that was the last thing that I mentioned, to athletes and musicians being able to use it to protect their hands. That takes us to the end of chapter 3, lesson 6. I have now given you every single answer that's on your assignment out of the 10 questions. They're in this video if you have paid attention and followed along. If you don't, well then, you can re-watch it and do your assignment, or it's going to be easier for you, just use your book. There's only like 3 pages of information there for you to find. That's all there is that we're going to talk to you about when it comes to plants. I've decided as I looked at the calendar and we're getting closer and closer and closer to the I step, I'm going to move forward into animals. So hopefully I'll have enough time to get into habitats before we get to the I step. So I'm not going to give you a test over plants. Tomorrow we will start on chapter 4.